Now I'm going to look at a block diagram of the agents. And the thinker and doer are there in the frontal lobes. And the experiencer is the one that has both the language representation and model of the world and the sensory representation and model of the world. And it gets the sensory model from the senses. And it gets the main way that we get our language model of the world is from our language input. Basically, we are taught the language model of the world as infants by our parents and in school. You know, when you're in school, you're learning concepts after concept after concept and building up that language model, and you know, you finally get a PhD in whatever subject area you're interested in. But I also want to point out this is actually a continuous hierarchy of categories between the sensory data and the language representation of the world. For example, in a visual system, an early stage in the visual system detects edges. So it can see here's an edge. And then it combines those edges to get a shape. So here's a shape. Then it combines shapes to get an object. And then there's places in the visual system that detect faces, for example. So those are all essentially concepts. The concept of an object, the concept of a face, are all detected in the visual system, and they become higher and higher levels of abstract concepts as they go up this hierarchy here. And once they get a word associated with, like the word face, now you're actually in the language model of the world, where the word face corresponds to that sensory perception of a face. And the global workspace here is a network of neurons that neuroscientists have identified, about a half a dozen nodes in the brain that connect the back of the brain to the front of the brain. And the claim is that they're necessary for conscious perception. So if you say that you can see me standing up here, it's your thinker that is getting information through your global workspace from this model of the world, and that allows you to see me here. Now remember that according to dual process theory, the thinker is the conscious agent, the doer is subconscious. The doer undoubtedly sees me also, but you're not aware of the doer's experience of me. It uses a different interface, and it does a fast interface, because the doer does things like sports. You have to have a fast interface to do sports. If you're trying to do sports with your thinker, you're going to lose every time. Okay, so in addition, the thinker can also produce thoughtful speech. Now, the great majority of speech we produce is the automatic speech that comes through from the doer. So if somebody asks you a question that you can easily answer, the language representation, the experiencer knows the answer, tells the doer, and the doer says it. If it's a question where you have to think about it and to figure out what the answer is, that's where the thinker is doing the thinking, and then you're using thoughtful speech to give the answer. Now again, it's the doer actually moving my lips, giving the answers, even if my thinker thought of the answer. So that's why the doer has to be involved here. All right, another thing that the thinker does besides doing thoughtful speech, it does the inner voice. And the inner voice is that little voice in your head you hear, and the experiencer recognizes it just as if it was an external voice talking. And for example, we can learn new concepts from our language input through our ears, but we can also learn new concepts that the thinker thinks up. So if the thinker thinks up a new concept, it can tell the experiencer about it, and now the experiencer will incorporate that new concept in its language model of the world. So that's the inner voice. In addition, there's an interface of top-down attention where both the thinker and the doer can tell the experiencer, pay attention to this area. So, and then the experiencer goes and does it. Now, the experiencer also knows all the goals of the thinker and doer. So if something comes into its sensory perception that corresponds to one of those goals, it can use bottom-up attention here to inform the thinker and the doer about whatever comes into the world. And then finally, the doer has to also tell the experiencer about any planned motion of the body, because if you move your body, you're going to get different sensory perceptions, and the experiencer has to take that into account when it's creating the model of the world. So this is the normal modern human. Now I'll show you an animal's example. And the animal has a thinker, but it's a weaker thinker. They have less, their frontal lobes expanded greatly as humans became modern humans, and animals have just less neurons in the frontal lobes than we do. And they also don't have the language input like we do. They don't learn a whole language from their nestmates and from their parents, and they don't have classes. So they don't have the complete language model of the world that we have. They do have concepts, though, but they're only the self-generated concepts created by the animal itself during its lifetime. And the more advanced animals do have quite a few concepts that they've created, but it's not this rich conceptual model of the world that we have created. And the other thing is that they don't have this thoughtful speech that we have. An example that demonstrates that is that chimpanzees, when they find a tree that's got a lot of abundant ripe fruit on it, they automatically emit a call, and that brings the other troop over to that tree so they can all share in the abundant fruit. Well, Jane Goodall did an experiment where she put a bunch of bananas out and hid them and waited for a chimpanzee to come and find them. The chimpanzee found the bananas, and the chimpanzee's thinker solved the problem of how do I keep all these bananas for myself? But the way it solved the problem was by putting his hand over his mouth. Because he couldn't use thoughtful speech to stop the automatic speech of calling out to his other troop members. And so he put his hand over his mouth to suppress that automatic speech so he could keep all the bananas for himself. Now, if these animal thinkers can't do thoughtful speech, they may not be able to do inner voice, but we'd have to ask them about that to see if that's true or not. We don't know. So this is the animals. So now in terms of the brain itself, the approximate locations of the agents are that the frontal lobes are shared by the thinker and doer, and the back three lobes of the brain are the experiencer. The back three lobes of the brain are the ones that have all the sensory input, primary sensory input areas, and the frontal lobes have the motor area that controls the body. It also has emotions in the frontal area, and the executive function is largely in the frontal area. Now, this is not a hard black line here. There are parts of the model of the world that can be in the frontal lobes, and there are parts of the thinker and doer that can be in the back three lobes of the brain.